Okay, let's start, and I want to welcome everybody in to join us for this first Hispanic Heritage Month event with UCANR. I want to thank a lot of people, and so as there are so many people I want to thank, that I'm just going to say thank you to everybody who has helped me make this possible, to be here right now, to open doors and pave the way, the way to make this a reality. So, with no further ado, we are going to see first some ground rules. Uh, we have what is a meeting format for the Zoom. So I will ask you, everybody, you're capable of doing that, mute your mic. When you want to speak, at the moment when we are going to ask questions, raise your hand to speak. You know, the little hand that is right here on your, when you go and see the chat room. And also be respectful to others. Be brief on your comment questions. Be respectful to others. Question ideas, not people. Practice active listening, and make I statements rather than generalize we statements. We also have the next slide, please. The agenda is right now we're the welcome. The next point will be the presentation of the video, Latino or Hispanic. Then we are going to introduce the Deportation, the Mexican America families video, and then the presentation of the video. When we come back, we're going to have some breakout discussions on both videos in groups. And then after we come back, which is going to be about 20 minutes on the breakout rooms, we're going to introduce the two guests that we have for today, and then we are open to questions and answers. Next slide, please. The breakout rooms. We have for you to consider the following questions for discussions. Do you realize that Latino and Hispanic are not the same? Were you aware of these deportations of almost 2 million Mexican Americans, which included 60% of us of US born, and how do you feel about it? Those will be the main questions, but I mean, feel free to discuss anything, whatever make you feel about these videos, or what you take, or anything that you want to comment. Everything is welcome. Catherine Soul is my co-host, and her and myself, we're going to go visiting you in the breakout rooms when it comes to it. And we're going to start now with the first video. And this first video is two and a half minutes long, and it gives us a perspective of, a lot of people have asked me, what should I call you? Are you a Latino? Are you Hispanic? Well, let's look at the video, because this is the answer that probably we're going to get the answer from here.
And Hispanic, and Latino. The two words are often used interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. The difference lies in the words themselves. Latino refers to geography. People who are from or descendants of Latin America. That's this area here on the globe. It includes most countries in Central and South America, as well as some in the Caribbean. 20 countries total, and some territories like Puerto Rico. The term Latin America was first used by Chilean politician Francisco Bilbao in 1856. It was used to describe countries in America whose predominant languages stem from Latin, so like Spanish, Portuguese, French. That's why Belize in Central America and Guyana and Suriname in South America are not part of Latin America. English is the official language of Belize and Guyana. Dutch and Sranan-Tongo are spoken in Suriname. We've recently adopted Latinx as a gender-neutral alternative to Latino and Latina. In the most literal sense, Hispanic also refers to language. People who are from or descendants of Spanish-speaking countries. That includes places like Spain in Europe, and some countries and territories in the Caribbean. It excludes countries like Brazil and others in Latin America where the predominant language isn't Spanish. According to the Cervantes Institute, more than 400 million people worldwide are from Spanish-speaking countries, and nearly 10% of those reside in the United States. That's a lot. And that's probably why the US government introduced the term in the 1970 census during Richard Nixon's presidency. So back to the beginning. The two terms shouldn't be used interchangeably because they're not the same thing. You can be Hispanic if you're from Spain, but that doesn't make you Latinx because you're not from a Latin American country. You're Latinx if you're from Brazil, but you're not Hispanic. But you can be both. I'm both. My family is from Mexico, both a Latin and Hispanic country. Now you know. And Latino.
And now you know. As I said, it is very short, that video. And we have Paul, we have a question to ask you. Let's see if we can have the poll now. Okay, it is right now. How many languages are spoken in Latin America? 2, 3, 5, or 10? Well, those who answer the 10 languages are correct, and those languages are Spanish, Portuguese, English, German, Italian, Arabic, Chinese, Ukrainian, Japanese, and Dutch. So we learn something new every day. Now we have the second video of today's forum. The second video is something that is an incident that happened. What we're gonna see is a documentary about an incident that happened in the late 30s up to mid 40s. Close to 2 million Mexican American families were deported to Mexico. 60% of them were US born. Let's take a look at the documentary.
Young Mexicans began to build families and moved east, across the Los Angeles River to Brooklyn Heights, Belvedere, and Boyle Heights, a diverse community in the mountains of East LA. It was there that Natividad Castañeda, a stonemason who had emigrated from Mexico in 1915, settled with his wife Gregoria and their 2 children, Francisco and his younger sister Emilia, born in Los Angeles in 1926.
It was a happy life that I had when I was a little girl. I used to like to go to school. We used to have some time to play before school started, before we went to do our Pledge of Allegiance. We went to the movies here and there. It used to be a nickel to go to the movies. We used to have a Victrola. I remember one of the records that they used to play. It was a song about Soy virgencita, entre las flores me encontrarás. We had a nice summer porch. We had an avocado in the back. My mother used to love avocados. Maybe my dad planted the avocado for her. En una mesa te puse un ramillete de flores. Mariana, no seas ingrata, regálame tus amores.
Closing time, the close of an era. In the 1920s, the great American word was prosperity. Now the 30s have begun and there is a new word, depression.
As the Depression deepened, competition for scarce jobs grew fierce. In laundries, factories, construction companies, Mexican workers were replaced by U.S. citizens.
Devastating is a good adjective to use for Mexicans in Los Angeles in the Depression. Very quickly, by 1931, half the population is unemployed, much larger than the general Los Angeles population. That means a lot of the people that had had fairly secure employment before this period now are out of work.
My father lost a job. He didn't want to receive relief. He didn't want to receive it. He wanted to work. But like I said, there was no work for Mexicans. At least my mother was working as a maid in a wealthy family.
President Hoover, by 1931, is desperate to stay in office. He is roundly blamed for the Depression, and he begins to look for scapegoats. And it's his Secretary of Labor who begins to say, well, if we simply got rid of Mexicans, we would have jobs for everyone else. Los Angeles begins to target the Mexican community. The first ever immigration raid is done at the plaza. Immigration authorities are brought in from other places to kind of surround the plaza. They end up capturing as many Japanese or Chinese Americans at the plaza than they do Mexicans. And they deport 15 people that day. But what they wanted to do is scare people, and they accomplished that. In the weeks following that immigration raid, people were scared to go to work. They were scared to go outside. This created a great panic, not only among the Mexican community, but also among their employers.
In Los Angeles, the Mexican consul suggested that instead of persecuting Mexicans, the city buy train tickets for anyone willing to return to Mexico, now peaceful a decade after the end of the revolution.
Initially, in 1931, when they start this, they have no problem filling the trains. There are plenty of people who are unemployed, who want to go back. By 32, they have trouble filling the trains, and that's when more coercive measures start to be used. County welfare officials begin to target certain neighborhoods that they know have a large number of unemployed Mexicans. They will go house to house. They will say, the cheese that you're getting, the bread we have been giving you is no longer going to be made available to you. Instead, we will give you this one ticket, and this is for a ride back to Mexico on a train. This is your only choice. You will get no more assistance.
For the Castañedas, the knock on the door came early in 1935, not long after tragedy struck the family.
My mother got sick with TB, and she died. She died in 1934, the 10th of May. I was making my first communion that day when my mother died. I remember when they buried her. I remember that they had to drag me out of there because I was so emotional what was happening to her, what was happening to us.
Natividad Castañeda was offered 3 tickets for himself and his 2 American-born children on a train going to Durango in northern Mexico.
We had a trunk, a big trunk, and the first thing that he put in there was his working tools. That's what went in there, and a couple of blankets that we had, a few cooking utensils and dishes, and what little clothing we had. Because we lost everything. We arrived at the train station that was very crowded. People crying, children and adults. I was approached by a man. He says that I could stay here, but I would become a ward of the state. You know, like you hear about these orphanages. I didn't want to be in an orphanage. I wanted to be with my father and my brother. I had a family.
Between 300,000 and 500,000 Mexicans and Mexican Americans are forced out of the United United States in the 1930s. There are plenty of Americans who said, we don't want the European immigrants anymore. There are plenty of Americans who said, we don't want any Italians, we don't want any Poles, we don't want any Jews. But there was never an action to round them up en masse and to send them back to their home countries. And this is what happened to Mexicans.
We went to live with this tia, my father's aunt. We really weren't welcome because, you know, there wasn't much room even for them. So we had to live outdoors, sleep outdoors. Pouring rain. There was no place for us to go but put up with the rain. There was no running water. We had to go miles to go wash clothes. My dad used to go to work. He taught my brother the trade. And I told him that I was leaving school, that I would be with him. I didn't have time to be playing here and there. I had to work.
Clearly, it sets up a pattern of wanting Mexican labor at times in which employment is needed and wanting people to just leave and go somewhere else when that labor is no longer needed.
To be marked as visibly Mexican in America in the 1930s is to put you and your family at risk. And so Mexicans become, in LA in the 1930s, what one historian has called the invisible minority. In other words, they withdraw from public life. It doesn't mean that their culture disappears, but it means that a community that had been so expansive and overflowing retreats into a kind of shell.
Emilia Castañeda returned home to Boyle Heights in 1944, after 9 years in Mexico. She was 17. The first thing she did was to brush up on her English, at the very school she'd attended up to the 4th grade.
Once when I was coming back from school, one of the neighbors asked me if I was Emilia. And I said, yes. And she says, I'm Maura. And she invited me to my home, the home that had been ours.
Emilia had lost it all, her home, her childhood, her family. Her father, Natividad Castañeda, could never again return to the United States.
Well, it seems like there was a little problem there. It's almost towards the end of the video. And basically, the last part is when they mentioned that it's about, the estimate is 2 million Latinos or Mexican Americans were deported, and that 60% of them were US born. And to talk about a little bit more of this issue and labels that our communities have to face, is with us Dr. Isidro Ortiz, a professor of Chicano Studies of San Diego State University. He's a political scientist by training. His research and instructions focus on Chicano political activism and the experiences of Chicano and other Latinos with oppression. He has co-edited 3 books and published articles in scholarly journals and popular publications. He considers himself a scholar activist and has been recognized for his activism, leadership, and mentoring contributions. Also, I don't know if it's already with us, Dr. Alfonso Gonzalez Toribio. He's an associate professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies and director of Latin America Studies program at the University of California, Riverside. He is a theorist of Latino and Latin America politics with a research agenda focused on issues of immigration control, human rights, migrant social movements, and the politics of race in the US, Mexico, and Central America. Dr. Gonzalez is the author of the award-winning Reform Without Justice, Latino migrant politics and the Homeland Security State. So without any further ado, I want to welcome both of them. And Dr. Ortiz, enlighten us on this dark stage of the Mexican Americans here in the country. This is not taught in schools, and even up to this date, very few Mexican Americans are aware of this incident. You're okay. You're unmuted.
Okay. Yes, that's correct. That whole era and what occurred has been often largely excluded from instruction in the public schools. It's only recently that we've begun to see treatments of it and recognition of how traumatic the experience was. And it partly has to do with the fact that the state of California has formally apologized for what occurred during that period. In 2005, the state passed a bill called the California Apology Act for the 1930s Repatriation Program. And it was considered to be the official recognition of what the bill described as the unconstitutional removal and coerced immigration of United States citizens and legal residents of Mexican descent, and for the fundamental violation of their basic civil rights and constitutional rights as a result of this period that's been described as one of illegal deportations and against coerced immigration. So that, I think, in 2005 helps to bring more attention to the fact that it did occur. And so now we're seeing discussions of it, public discussions of it. And I wanted to make a couple of points related to that documentary about the deportations.
Dr.
Yes.
Ortiz, allow me to interrupt you there.
Yes.
We are going to go into a breakout rooms.
Yes, okay.
I just wanted to give you us a little perspective.
Right. Yes, perspective,
So
yes.
in the breakout rooms, the people who are here joining us, they have a little bit more meat to discuss.
Yes.
Because we capture the video. But for the breakout rooms, I just want to ask you the following, consider the following questions for discussion. Do you realize that Latino and Hispanic are not the same? Were you aware of these deportations of almost, as I said, 2 million Mexican Americans, which included 60% of US born, and how do you feel about it? We're going to be on the breakout rooms for about 20-25 minutes, and then we're coming back. If you have questions for Dr. Ortiz, please write them down. And the procedure for the questions is you go to the chat, write your question, raise your hand, and then we'll be calling your name. And please unmute yourself at that point, ask your question, and mute yourself back. So right now, let's go to the breakout rooms, and we will come back here in about 20 minutes. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I hope you had a nice discussion in the breakout rooms. Let's go to the question and answer stage. And before we start doing that, please, anybody who wants to ask a question, follow these steps. Place your question in the chat room, raise your hand, wait until we call your name, then unmute your mic, briefly introduce yourself and ask the question, and then mute back your mic, and Dr. Ortiz will respond to your question. And so let's start if anybody has a question. If not, Dr. Ortiz, you're unmuted. Okay, wonderful. We were talking about in regards to the video of the deportations, the California government is already taking steps to somehow at least apologize for that?
Yes, as I pointed out in 2005, California actually passed a bill. Again, it's called the 2005 California Apology Act for the 1930s Repatriation Program. And it was an apology in recognition of that the deportations, but they were called repatriations, actually were coerced, and as were the removals, and that what was involved was violations of basic civil liberties and constitutional rights during that era, during those so-called repatriation campaigns. So that, I think, like I said earlier, I think has helped to bring more attention to what occurred in the 1930s.
Dr. Ortiz, do you think the government acted against these Mexican families, Mexican-American families, or why? But they never did something similar to other ethnic groups such as Italian, Polish, Irish. I mean, it was talk about it, but there was never action, a similar action like that.
Yes, there's never been, as far as I know, massive deportations of other ethnic groups. And partly I think it has to do with who is seen as white. So for example, the Irish for a long time were not recognized as being white. And so they were significantly oppressed throughout the United States. But at some point they do become white, accepted as white. And so the mistreatment of them ends. But in the case of Mexicans, they're, even though legally in California and places like Texas, they were legally white, have never really been fully accepted as white. In fact, they've been, they've also been excluded from being perceived as Americans. In other words, they've never been imagined as Americans. And I would say that even that's still the case today, that they're not imagined as part of the American community. So if you're not imagined as a full member of the community, then that makes you vulnerable to the kinds of actions that occurred in the past and that are still occurring today.
And that's the good segue to the next question, because the question is there a parallel between what happened in the 30s, mid 40s, and what our community is going through nowadays?
Yes, well, in terms of the community is being subjected to deportations, we know that. And we're also seeing members of the community deported, and those who are left behind, especially the children, experiencing trauma. And when a person is deported, it affects them immediately, but it also can affect their family, and then it also affects the communities in which they have been living in, so that those who are left behind are left with a fear that perhaps they too would be susceptible to being deported. And so, similar thing occurred in the 1930s. I pointed out to the members of the chat group, the breakout room, that one of the legacies of the 1930s deportations was that those who were left behind, we began to see a pattern of withdrawal from contact with governmental agencies. And that pattern was documented as late as 1970, when UCLA did a study that was published in the book called The Mexican American People. And one of their key findings was, again, that Mexican Americans in Los Angeles who knew of what had occurred in the 1930s, again, had embraced this pattern of withdrawing from contact with governmental agencies, which certainly did not help, naturalization efforts.
Dr. Ortiz, we have Carmen.
Yes,
who
Carmen
has a question. I'm going to unmute Carmen, if I can. Carmen, unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Hi, yeah, my name is Carmen. My pronouns are she, her, hers. The question I wanted to ask was, do you think a formal apology from the state of California is enough, or is there something more that needs to be done in order to heal as a state from the deportation?
I think it was a beginning, but at that time, there were some who said, well, if the state of California is going to apologize, there ought to be reparations also for the losses that occurred during that period. But those reparations didn't occur. And so that would be a way of acknowledging. So in the case of the internments, I believe there were reparations, but it didn't occur in terms of those who were deported and the losses that they suffered.
We have another question from Catherine Soul. Catherine?
Yeah, thank you. It came up in several of the rooms as I moved in between them. I heard people discussing the term Latinx, which was used in the first clip. And a number of people in the groups indicated that they identify as Latino or Latina, not as Latinx. So I'm curious what you think about the term Latinx and whether white academics should use the term when we're referring to our clientele.
Okay, so that first segment that we saw on video, I think was a little bit, it was correct, and yet it was a little bit incomplete, let's put it that way. It didn't talk about the fact that the Census Bureau that came up with the term Latinos, or excuse me, Hispanics, actually has a formal definition of what Latinos are. And they define Hispanic or Latino as a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race. And so people who identify with the terms Hispanic or Latino are those who classify themselves in one of the specific Hispanic or Latino categories, which include Mexican, Mexican American, Chicano, Puerto Rican, or Cuban, as well as those who indicate that they are another Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. So the Census Bureau, in other words, has a definition, but who gets put into that category? To do that, they use a technique called the self-identification technique. They allow people to self-identify, so that if you say you're Latino or in one of those categories, for the Census Bureau, you are in the Hispanics category. So it is the case that Hispanics and Latinos are used interchangeably, as was pointed out that the Hispanics term was invented or constructed in 1970 and has been around for some time. And so Hispanics and Latinos are considered pan-ethnic labels or umbrella terms. And what we know from the research done is that at this point, the majority of Latinos don't use either of those terms for purposes of self-identification. They identify primarily in terms of family's country of origin. So if you ask someone, what are you? They might say, soy Mexicano, or soy Salvadoreño, or Guatemalteco, but rarely will they use the term Hispanics or Latinos. So, so bureaucratically, those terms are convenient for the Census Bureau, but they're not necessarily very useful because they tend to homogenize a very diverse population, and in the process obscure things like the different histories. And now more recently, of course, we have the term Latinx, and we have prominent Latinos using the term. For example, Congressman Julian Castro is using the term Latinx. But a study by the Pew Center tells us that as of today, only 23% of Latinos have have heard of the term Latinx, and only 3% actually use it. So your question was, well, is it appropriate for others outside the community to use it? I would say yes, but what's also important to note is that some people in the community might take that term, might object to the usage of that term to refer to them. And so, yes, the comment is, yes, recently some have said that perhaps the term Latine, Latine, might be even more appropriate. The spirit of Latinx was to try to be more inclusive than the previous terms, because the previous terms were regarded as having a gender bias. And so Latinx was set forth. And so those who are have been discussing the term Latin say, well, even Latinx has a bias. So let's move to the E, because in Spanish, the E is neutral in terms of gender. So it's better than Latinx. So that question always comes up as to, well, what term should I use when I'm talking to or referring to Latinos? And my suggestion has always been, well, why don't you ask people what they want to be called? So the other point about all of these terms, of course, is that all of the terms have a different history, and all of them are controversial in their own way, in part because there's different meanings that have come to be attached to those terms, and or may also involve how the terms came to be. So for example, I don't identify using the term Hispanic, and it has to do with the meaning that and how I perceive the term. So for example, for me, as someone who identified as a Chicano and still identifies as a Chicano, the term for me, the term Hispanics tends to privilege the European connection, and it obscures part of our rich cultural heritage, which is the indigenous and the African part of our cultural heritages. And so, if I prefer the term Latinos, I think it's if we're going to talk using these global terms, then I prefer the term Latinos, and I'll say, if you give me the choice between Hispanics and Latinos, I'll say I'm a Latino. But initially, my identity was as Chicano.
Okay, we have another question, Dr. Ortiz. This is from Samantha Carnica Perez. Samantha, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, I think what you said, Dr. Ortiz, is that I think it's, or I guess like how Ricardo mentioned, I feel that I don't categorize myself as Latinx. I feel that it's the new generation that put that because they're more progressive.
Yeah.
But I feel, I think because Latinos, in Spanish, it's masculine, Latinos. You're categorizing a male and a female, so that's why it's Latinos.
Yeah.
But I completely agree. Even if someone asks me, like when they fill in your bubble of what race you're in, I still put Latinos. Hispanic, as you mentioned, those are for within our culture, it's Spain. Spain is rich. They have the money. They're higher than us versus us Mexicans. We were the Indios.
Yes.
So I personally tell myself that I'm Mexican. I'm not Latino, I'm not Hispanic, I'm Mexican. That's where I come from. I know for you use the term Chicano because again, if you want to mention what the difference between Chicano is, most people could relate to that era. If you were born during that progressive Chicano movement. But I completely agree that I don't use that term. And I know for those who are not, are Latinos themselves, they're confused, like, okay, so what do I call you? Just plain honestly say like, oh, where are you from? What would you want to be referred? Simple as that.
Yes.
Yeah, some people might get offended by calling, oh, you're Latino X. Like, no, that's gonna get them upset. So just asking them right away. And I know they're trying to change and make it the term more acceptable, but I don't think it's ever going to be acceptable because it's like an umbrella. We're not all under the same umbrella. We all have different, my husband's Peruvian. He's not the same as me. I'm not completely, he has different background than I am. He has different religious beliefs, different traditions. Don't put me in the same category as a Peruvian because I'm not Peruvian. I'm Mexican. So I guess I wanted to say that, again, as Ricardo mentioned, I feel that term Latinx is more for the new generation that's more progressive, and it's not, it's somewhat offending to me at least, because I don't appreciate being called Latinx. I'm not Latinx. I'm Mexican, or I would prefer, like you said, Latino. I'm not in the Hispanic culture because I am not from Spain. I'm from Mexico.
Okay, Samantha, thank you very much. We have a question here for you, Dr. Ortiz, as well, and it's for Kim Ingram. She says, do we have a sense of the 60% of American-born people that were deported? How many returned?
Yes, there is data, but I don't recall the percentage right now. But yes, many were able to return. But again, I don't recall that it was just off the top of my head. I don't recall that it was a majority of those who were deported.
And then we have another question from Randall Oliver. Randall, will you unmute yourself and answer the question, please?
So my question is somebody who grew up in Southern California and have lived in California for most of my life, except for a brief time in Texas. But what is the perspective in terms of why this was never part of the education of people here? You know, I feel strange that I've been here most of my life and have never heard of this issue.
Why was it? Because again, there's been a general exclusion omission of the histories of people of color by and large in instruction. And that's why today you see this very strong ethnic studies movement across California to try to formally incorporate into the curriculum the teachings about the histories, the contributions, the roles, the status, the experiences of Chicanos, African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, because all of those groups, history has been excluded. And it has to do, of course, with who controlled the curriculum. And so, you know, those who control have the power not only write the story at large, but they also have the power to omit. And so those histories have been omitted. And so, as you may know, there was an actual bill in the legislature that was approved to incorporate ethnic studies as a graduation requirement in the high schools. There's controversy about what that will look like and whether or not it actually addresses what those who proposed the legislation initially really wanted in terms of overcoming the omission, but it's there. And now in the CSU system, where I teach, because of a bill introduced by Assemblywoman Shirley Weber, all CSU students will be required to take one course in ethnic studies as a graduation requirement. And that has never occurred before, so we're having this formal introduction of this requirement now. And that should help, but you know, think of it, it's over 100 years in terms of the experiences of Chicanos in California. And so finally now, and again, it's been there's still much to be done. So for example, I teach a class called Chicano Role in American Politics. I'm teaching that this semester. And one of the first book that I use is a book called American Dreams. And it's about the American dream in the post-World War II period. And I use it because the course requirement is that there be some survey of American history. And this book provides a very nice survey of post-World War II US history. But I keep reading the chapter on the period from 1945 to 1965, and I keep seeing these glaring omissions. For example, there is no mention of what occurred in 1954 when the US launched another deportation campaign called Operation Wetback. There's no mention of the fact that in 1954, there was a historic case, the case of Hernandez versus Texas, where the US Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment applied to Mexican Americans in the United States. I mean, those are some very significant omissions from all many different standpoints, right? And so, so again, you know, that's how we see the omission. This is a book that is widely used across the country by a very prominent historian, H.W. Brands, who teaches at the University of Texas at Austin. But again, here's the kind of glaring omissions that again have been repeated over and over again for a long time. And then of course, you know, we know that President Trump this week said that he was going to call for patriotic education in the schools. And so that for me means again, the continuation of the old whitewash history, right? The kind I was taught when I was in elementary school in Texas, where there was no mention of Mexicans, and if there was any mention, it was always a very pejorative mention. And so if you were Mexican American, you experienced what one of my friends calls Alamo trauma. The only thing you knew about yourself as a people was that your people had killed Davy Crockett at the Alamo. And beyond that, nothing else about the positive contributions made by Mexican Americans and Mexicanos in Texas.
Dr. Ortiz, we have another question, and I know this is something that is very dear to your heart, and you are more than an expert in that. Can you please define Chicano? Catherine Columber says, I have heard different explanations.
Okay, so in 1970, 50 years ago, I became a Chicano, okay? People who identify as Chicanos, we aren't born Chicanos. We adopted that identity as a result of the experiences that we underwent. And so in 1970, I became a Chicano. And so what did I mean by that? What do I mean by it now? I mean by it that for me, a Chicano defined descriptively means first, a person of Mexican origin, born in the United States, someone who takes great pride in their cultural heritage, especially the indigenous part of the cultural heritage, someone who embraces the identity of Chicano, someone who also, as we saw ourselves back then, began to see ourselves as members of a community that historically had experienced oppression in the United States. We also were people who took a position of opposition to what can be described as coercive assimilation that we experienced in the schools, like the schools in Texas, where we were punished for speaking Spanish on school grounds as part of an effort to de-Mexicanize us culturally. Okay, and it also, for me, meant that we were willing to engage in collective action to change those conditions. And to use the current term now, we were woke. It meant that we were aware of what had happened to us, what was happening to us in terms of the injustices and so on. So you can define it, like in that way. But as I said earlier, the terms also have meaning. So you can find discussions today that, for example, there's a discussion that says, what does it mean to be Chicano? And so Armando Rendon, who wrote a book called the Chicano Manifesto, says, quote, I am Chicano. What that means to me may be entirely different from what meaning the word has for you. To be Chicano is to find out something about oneself which has lain dormant, subverted, or nearly destroyed. Chich Marin, the comedian, who, as some of you may know, is going to have a museum in Riverside, probably the major collection of Chicano art. He says, quote, and that was the defining epiphany. A Chicano was someone who could do anything. A Chicano was someone who wasn't going to get ripped off. He was Uncle Rudy. He was industrious, inventive. Hispanic my ass. I've been Chicano ever since, okay? So that's his take on Chicano. And then you have a young Chicana who says, quote, Chicana doesn't simply mean that you are a certain ethnicity. No, it means that you are aware that there's a struggle going down with your people and that you will make sure you'll stand up and do something about it, end of quote, right? So again, different meanings attached to the term. And so like other terms, it's controversial still, right? Initially in my grandparents' generation, it was a term used to refer to people who were seen as lower class. My generation took it and turned it on its head and made it a positive term. But there are some people who today know the history and they say, well, Chicano really means that you're a militant because those who became Chicanos in the 60s were out in the streets protesting and so on. So I don't want to be seen as a militant, therefore, please don't call me Chicano. I think their misreading of it is incorrect, but they're entitled to whatever they want to be called. Among Chicanos, among Latinos, respect is a very important value. And so I tell my students that if we honor that value, then we should allow people to define themselves as they seek to do so. And so one of the political reasons I don't use the term Hispanics is because it violates a very important principle of the movement of which I was a part of, the Chicano movement. And that principle is called the principle of self-determination, which basically holds that a community ought to have the right to determine what it calls itself, and that it ought not to have terms like Hispanics imposed on them. And even the term Latinx is inclusive as it tries to be. There are some members of my generation who are resisting it because they feel they're being imposed upon again. And I have friends, some of whom say, I'll be a Chicano till the day I die, you know, and they're kind of harsh on the younger generation. I think the harshness is not necessarily called for, but, you know, again, people have embraced these terms, and these terms have come to have a very important meaning to them. So they don't let them go easily.
Dr. Ortiz, we have another question from Randall, Oliver Randall.
Yeah, Dr. Ortiz, you said American Dreams even has omissions in it.
Yes.
Is there a publication, a book, some kind of material that you'd recommend that people can use to get that historical perspective?
What I've been doing is supplementing with readings and documentaries that address those things that are omitted. So unfortunately, some of them are not yet readily available. For example, there is an excellent documentary called A Class Apart that was done by PBS, and it focuses on the class of Hernandez versus Texas. And but unfortunately, PBS hasn't made that readily available so that one could access it, say, through YouTube. So that's one of the challenges today in terms of trying to overcome the omissions, is that these very important works are not readily available, even to me as an instructor. And so that's something that needs to be worked on. So next question is, please define Poacho. Okay, a Poacho is the English translation would be poached. So if you're called a Poacho, it's like you're a half-baked Mexican. And in the past, it was a derogatory term used by people in Mexico to refer to Mexican Americans who they perceived to be not fully Mexican. So I would go to Mexico and I'd say, yo soy Mexicano, I'm a Mexican. And my cousins would say, no, tú eres Poacho. No, you're a Poacho, you're a half-baked Mexican. So I was neither fully accepted here nor fully accepted there.
Yeah, it was a kind of a very derogatory term.
Yes.
For Mexicans who live in the States.
Yes.
At the time. Well, we're almost getting towards the end of the forum. Is anybody else who would like to ask any questions, or if not, well, Dr. Ortiz, thank you very much for the pleasure of listening to you and having you in this discussion. Certainly you brought up things that your perspective that we're challenging some of them.
Yes.
Others were an eye-opener, but thank you very much. It was wonderful. I think we should do it again. And
yes.
a little bit more about the Chicano movement, because I know that's your expertise, and that's something we can talk from the art perspective, the political perspective, and how nowadays is being probably the need to have something like that.
Yes, yes. And I was going to, just before we go, I was going to suggest that if any of you want to follow up on this, someone whose work you should read is the work of Professor Ian Haney Lopez, who's a professor of law at Berkeley. And he has written extensively about Chicanos and Latinos and the whole issue of whiteness, the racial identity. That's something we didn't really fully explore. So again, it's Ian Haney Lopez. He was actually President Obama's classmate at Harvard in law school. And so again, I would suggest you can follow up on that. Again, very informative, very insightful in terms of the racial identity of Latinos in the United States.
It's Ian Haney Lopez?
Ian Haney Lopez. I-A-N, Haney, H-A-N-E-Y dash Lopez.
Wonderful. Well, okay. Thank you very much. And,
thank you.
Can we get the last slide, please? I don't know if we're going to have it. Well, before we go, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. Certainly, this was very successful. I really am very emotional, very excited about this. And I want to invite you as well to join us September 25th, next Friday, from 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. We're going to have the 3 UCANR staff, employees, academics who were honorees this Hispanic Heritage Month. Claudia Diaz, Javier Miramontes, Sonia Rios. Please join us to talk to them, get to learn their experiences of being Latinos and working in the fields and how it has helped them to achieve UCANR mission, and also what motivates them to join ANR. They have wonderful, wonderful stories, each one of them, and you know, each one of them has broken mold in their working out of the box and so on and so forth, and probably everybody, we can learn something from all of them. Once again, thank you very much, and I hope to see you September 25th, 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you.